So earlier today, I got this comment on a video that I did about 4.5 years ago. So also, before I get into it, big thanks to this individual because they're constantly writing really detailed and interesting comments on all my videos. So thank you for that. And thank you for reminding me of this video. It's been a long, I don't think I've seen it since it initially was published back in 2020. So as I was rewatching it, I was reminded of this concept that I sort of came up with to make the video. And I think it's a really important one. So I want to resurrect it a little bit here just because when I first put the video out, the channel was quite a lot smaller. So there's a lot of new people here. So I want to play a section of that video for you to hear. And I'm going to tell you whether or not I still believe in this or there's maybe some new concepts that I can add to it. And I want to finish this video off with a short clip of a podcast that I recorded earlier today. It's not going to be out for several weeks, so if you're listening to this video now, you get a quick snippet of a really interesting podcast that will come out later this spring. But it's a really fascinating, interesting story that this individual has with an encounter with a wild snake that they had in South America. So I'll let that clip play as well at the end. Let's jump into this initial clip. So we're going to do some crude calculations to determine roughly the volume that a snake takes up or a volume that the snake displaces. And the way we're going to do that is use the formula for calculating the volume of a cylinder. I am well aware snakes are not perfect cylinders. Of course, they taper at the tail and the neck and whatnot, but it doesn't matter because the concept is still exactly the same. So I don't want you to get too hung up on the figures. If you see a diameter that I'm using as an example and it's not quite what you've experienced with that species, or if you are concerned that I'm using the formula for a cylinder to figure out the volume of a snake, it's okay. These are not going to be exact perfect numbers, but it still illustrates the concept nicely. Okay, so let's move on to a couple theoretical examples here. So here we have a corn snake. I know this is my imaginary corn snake. It's not a great looking corn snake, but it will work for this example. So here we go. This is what he looks like, and he is 5 feet long or 152 centimeters. Now this particular snake is roughly 3 centimeters at its thickest part for its diameter. So that gives us a circumference of roughly that of a Canadian $2 coin, or as we call a toonie. So if you're not quite sure that's what it looks like, that's sort of the size. Now again, it could be bigger, it could be smaller, it doesn't matter. The concept is still the same. So when we figure out the area of this particular corn snake, when we take pi r squared times the total length, we get 1,077 centimeters cubed. Okay, so let's put this little guy into his enclosure. Now for the rest of this video, I'm just going to use the full total length of the snake as the minimum enclosure length size, just to keep the math very simple and basic. So this is a 5-foot enclosure that's 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide. So when we figure out the total volume of this enclosure, it is 566,337 centimeters cubed. Now, the question that I have is how many times can this little snake fit into this enclosure by volume? So we take those two numbers and we divide them and we get the number of 525. So in other words, this corn snake can fit into his enclosure roughly 525 times, which seems like a lot. So now let's move on to another example. We're going to use a reticulated python for this example, and this is where things get interesting. So this reticulated python, we'll say, is 10 feet long or 305 centimeters. So it's a relatively small retic. It's maybe only a couple of years old. And we'll say it has a diameter at its widest point of about 10 centimeters. And that happens to be about the thickness of this coffee mug. So you can imagine that's probably about right. A 10-foot snake is probably about that. Now, to figure out the volume of the snake, we just do like we did last time, and this particular snake has a volume of 23,939 centimeters cubed. Now, let's put this snake in a 10-foot long enclosure. So we have a 10-foot long enclosure here that's 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide. And some of you guys may say, whoa, 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 you would never put a 10-foot long reticulated python in only a 2-foot tall enclosure. Yes, that's probably true. I'm still going to use this as an example because you're going to see right away how little that matters. So this enclosure is 1,132,674 centimeters cubed, which sounds quite large. But let's see how many times this python can fit in this enclosure. Divide those two numbers, and we only get 47. That snake can only fit in that enclosure 47 times, which is a massive difference from the 525 times that we saw from the corn snake, still using the 10-foot or the total length rule to figure out how large the enclosure should be. So here's where the math gets really interesting. If we wanted to give this reticulated python an enclosure that matched proportionally what the corn snake has, i.e. give it an enclosure that it could fit into 525 times, this is how large it will be. Let's keep the 10-foot length for now, just to keep everything the same. 10 feet long, it would have to be 8 feet tall and 5.5 feet wide, which is almost half of the room that I'm in right now. That is a very massive enclosure, and I know some people with reticulated pythons have huge enclosures, but again, this is only a 10-foot reticulated python. This snake is only half grown you would have to go much, much larger for a full-grown reticulated python just to hit the 525, which is an arbitrary number, and we'll talk about that later. So the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that a snake's size is heavily dependent on its circumference or its diameter, however you want to take that thickness measurement. Length obviously plays a role, but the thickness of the snake plays a much larger role. You have to go back to when you were in grade school and you were doing the area of a circle. Remember, pi r squared. When you double the radius of a circle, you're not doubling the area. You're effectively quadrupling the area of that circle. So when you take a 10-foot snake, it is not merely twice as large as a 5-foot snake. Depending on the species, it could be anywhere between 15 to 20 to 25 times larger when you account for the volume of space that that snake displaces. Now, of course, the point of this is not to shame people who own larger snakes. I own larger snakes, and the chances of me eventually in the future having an enclosure that fits these guys in 500 times their volume is very slim, because that would take up an entire room for 2 or 3 enclosures, and it's unpractical. But I do feel myself gravitating towards smaller species of snakes. I guarantee you the next snake I pick up will be a small species of snake, just because the potential of the enclosure is so much more. If I have a snake that only stays, 3 or 4 feet long, if I offer it that 5-foot long enclosure, it's going to have an abundance of space, and it's something that I could never replicate with a larger, heavier bodied animal. So I think the concept of conceptualizing the amount of space your animal displaces in the enclosure and really thinking of it through the thickness of the animal itself is a really important one. As I said in the video, the thicker you get, you're not just doubling the size of your animal, you're quite often tripling or quadrupling or even more the size of your animal, which means the animal has less places to go in that enclosure. Now, obviously, the snakes are not able to use every square inch of the enclosure because a lot of that is air and space that they can't utilize, which comes to more decor, how you actually organize the enclosure so the animal can use more space. But the point is that the more spaces, the more options that animal has, the more environmental niches they're going to have within the enclosure, so they can regulate their temperature, the humidity, and the light that they're experiencing, and so on and so on. Now, I think one concept that I missed in that video that I think is worth discussing is the activity of the species you're keeping. Some species are incredibly active, they're fast moving, they have large ranges within the wild, and some have a very small range. Some don't move a lot in the wild. Maybe they're essentially ambush predators and they barely move at all, or maybe when they do move, it's only for short distances. Now, that's not to say that the low activity species, it's not to say we don't put any value on that activity, because it is still crucial. Even if they're only active 3 or 4 times a year, we still want to be able to provide that to them in captivity. But maybe they don't need a massive enclosure. Maybe once every week or so, or once a month, they have an option to get out of their enclosure and explore a larger space. And that mimics the experience they have in the wild on occasion when they actually move from one hide to another, for example. But I think there are instances where there are species that are very fast moving and very high activity, who every day are going to be exploring every single inch of the enclosure. Those species definitely will require much larger space, because you're not going to be there every day to move them into an explored sort of jungle gym type room, where you see lots of keepers doing that now, where they have an external piece, an external area outside of the animal's enclosure for the animal to use and exercise, and then they go back into their enclosure at the end of the day type thing. If it's a highly active species, that may not be as reasonable, because you're not going to be able to do that every single day. And that leads me into a great story that I was just told by my guest, Daniel Solis. He is a hotel owner, actually like an eco lodge owner in Costa Rica. He also has spent a ton of time doing different sort of herping expeditions across the world. And I want you to hear this story about his experience with a cribo in the wild, and how that changed the way he thinks about keeping them in captivity.
One of them that is very memorable is a Drymericon bicolor, the one in Ecuador. I saw it in the Amazon in Ecuador. So we went to this lodge. We're gonna go herping, photograph stuff. The people at the lodge have told me down the path there's a pond. We see a snake there every day. It always crosses in the afternoon or in the morning. And I'm like, all right, what kind is it, or how is it? Oh, it's big and it's black and orange. I'm like, all right. So we pretty much had an idea that it was a Drymericon. Indigo, no.
A cribo.
What's the common name? A cribo. So we knew that it was a cribo. And sure enough, in the afternoon, we're sitting around lunching, and one of the workers goes, hey, the snake is back. It was a large female, probably like 7 feet. So we chased it. We were able to grab it. And sure enough, we let it go. We photographed it, let it go. We kind of just held it to to photograph it, let it go. The next day, it did the same loop. I realized that cribos have a range. They know their area. We did a drone shot of the snake living through the water. Then I realized that the range that this animal had, it's huge.
Mm.
We're talking about, he had a small pond in the middle. I don't know, just like a parking lot. So the area that this snake it's patrolling, there's no way we can keep anything in captivity that can even come close to that size.
It's like a football field or something.
It's like, okay, there you go. It's a football field. In the middle, there's a pond. This snake knows every part of that area, and he lives there. He hunts, he breeds, he moves, he knows where to go, and it's about a football field.
Mm-hmm.
And back at home, and again, it doesn't help me criticize anybody, but I remember in literature suggesting that a 6-foot cage, it's enough for a cribo. There's no way. That animal moves so fast in the wild. He knows where the area of the pond has frogs at a specific time of the year, the seasons. He knows what area is dry. He knows where to hide. He knows everything. That to me probably was an eye opener.
So I think that story is so valuable to people. Again, it's not to shame people who own cribos or who own fast-moving colubrids, but it does really put that into perspective. If they are utilizing essentially a football field constantly and have that area mapped out, what could we do in captivity to provide something similar? I mean, you could never provide anything even a tenth that big, but can you have an area in your home that's dedicated to allow for activity, allow them to use their brain and map out an area and solve problems? You know, there are ways to get around the fact that in the wild they are utilizing such a large space and using their mind in a way that's constantly problem solving and mapping out territory. If there's a way you can do that in captivity, then I think you can get away with it. But I think the reminder is large species that are fast-moving and very intelligent are probably not suited for most people. And I think that brings us all the way back to the message that I constantly give on the podcast, which is we should always be gravitating towards smaller species, especially species that are, I shouldn't say overly active. I don't think there's anything wrong with us keeping active species in captivity, but there are certain animals that are very fast and they can make a 10-yard dash in an instant. Those are the sort of animals that maybe we shouldn't be keeping in captivity, or if you are, you need to be providing a large space. So anyway, that's the end of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. Again, I just wanted to rebring this idea of volume displacement back to the newer viewers who haven't experienced that message before. And also, hopefully you enjoyed that clip of the podcast. If you want to listen to the rest of the podcast, because it's such an amazing episode. In the episode, Daniel gives us these really amazing insights on reticulated python keeping, anaconda keeping, and a few other species as well. I won't spoil it. It'll be out in a few weeks. So if you want to, make sure you watch that, subscribe to the channel, and you will see it then. And until then, I'll see you in the next podcast or video.